The wind howled through the pine trees like 1,000 angry wolves, their branches heavy with the weight of early November snow. Up on the ridge, where the dirt road narrowed to little more than a hiking trail, a small log cabin stood defiant against the gathering storm. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin gray ribbon, quickly torn apart by gusts that promised the worst winter in decades. Inside that cabin, Martha Reynolds sat by her wood stove, her weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee, watching through frosted windows as the first real blizzard of the season began to show its teeth. She had lived in this cabin for 37 years. She and Thomas had built it themselves, log by log, nail by nail, back when their hands were young and their dreams were as vast as the Montana sky. They had raised 2 children here, watched them grow strong in the thin mountain air, taught them to respect the wilderness and never underestimate winter's fury. The children were grown now, living in cities far away, calling every Sunday to ask when she would come down from the mountain, when she would sell the cabin and move into something sensible, something safe. But Martha had no intention of leaving. This cabin held every memory of her life with Thomas, every sunrise they had watched together, every storm they had weathered side by side. Thomas had been gone 3 years now, taken by a heart that finally wore out after decades of hard mountain living. But Martha could still feel him in every corner of this place, still heard his laugh in the creak of the floorboards, still saw his smile in the dance of firelight on the walls. The problem had started last winter. Martha had noticed it during the big January storm, when snow had piled up 6 feet deep and the wind had driven it into drifts that reached the eaves of the cabin. The front porch, which wrapped around 2 sides of the structure, had always been their haven in warmer months. Thomas had built it extra wide, with a solid roof and sturdy posts, a place where they could sit and watch the wildlife, drink their morning coffee, shell peas from the garden. But last winter, Martha had discovered that the porch had a fatal flaw. The snow, driven by relentless wind, had found every gap between the floorboards, every crack in the walls where porch met cabin. It had drifted up under the roof, packed itself into solid masses against the cabin walls. And then, when the temperature fluctuated as it always did in the mountains, melting by day and freezing by night, it had turned to ice and begun to seep inside. First, she had noticed water stains on the interior walls, dark patches that spread like bruises across the pine logs. Then came the drips, finding their way through impossible spaces, running down inside the walls where she could hear them, but could not reach them. By the time the thaw came in March, the damage was extensive. The logs along the base of the wall had stayed wet too long and had begun to rot. The beautiful pine floors that Thomas had sanded and finished with such care had warped and buckled in places. Martha had spent the spring and summer doing what repairs she could manage alone, replacing sections of flooring, treating the logs with preservative, doing her best to seal every crack and gap. But she knew that when winter returned, the problem would return with it. The porch design itself was flawed. It trapped the snow, funneled it against the cabin walls, and turned what should have been protection into a liability. Martha had spent months thinking about solutions. She could not afford to tear down the porch and rebuild it, even if she had the strength to do so. Contractors who would come this far up the mountain charged prices that would drain her modest savings in a matter of days. She had considered various forms of weather stripping, different types of barriers and shields, but nothing seemed adequate for the sheer volume of snow that could accumulate here, the tremendous force of wind that could drive it into spaces that seemed impossible. Then, one day in late summer, while driving past the Larson Ranch down in the valley, she had seen their hay barn and something had clicked in her mind. Hay bales. Dense, tightly packed hay bales. They were used by farmers all over the region as windbreaks, as insulation for livestock shelters, as temporary walls for all manner of purposes. They were cheap, or at least far cheaper than lumber or proper insulation, They were heavy enough to stay put in wind. And most importantly, they were porous enough to allow air circulation while still blocking the direct force of wind and the drift of snow. If she could stack hay bales around the perimeter of her porch, creating a barrier between the porch posts and the space beyond, she might be able to stop the snow from packing itself against her cabin walls. The hay would catch the snow, yes, but it would hold it away from the structure, and the airspace between the hay and the cabin would prevent the direct contact that caused the melting and seeping. It was not an elegant solution. It was not what anyone would call attractive. But Martha had long ago learned that in the mountains, what worked was beautiful, and what failed was foolish, regardless of how it looked. She had called the Larson Ranch and arranged to buy 20 hay bales, far more than she needed, but they only sold them by the score. She had paid young Danny Larson to deliver them in his pickup and help her stack them around the porch. The work had taken most of a day, and by the time they were finished, the front of Martha's cabin looked like it was surrounded by a fortress of golden hay. The bales were stacked too high in most places, creating a wall about 4 feet tall that ran along the outer edge of the porch, just inside the posts. She had left gaps for the stairs and for access to different sections of the porch, but otherwise the hay formed a continuous barrier. Danny had been polite enough not to say anything, though Martha had seen the doubt in his eyes. She had tipped him well and sent him on his way, then stood back to survey her work. It looked absurd, she had to admit. It looked like something a crazy old woman would do, something born of confusion or desperation rather than reason. But Martha knew her reasoning was sound. She had thought it through from every angle, considered every objection, and she believed it would work. The real trouble had started when visitors began arriving. First had been her daughter Susan, up from Billings with her husband and 2 teenage grandchildren for a September weekend. Martha had seen Susan's face when they pulled up the driveway, had watched shock transform into embarrassment and then concern. Susan had taken her aside, speaking in that careful tone people use when they are worried about someone's mental state, asking if everything was all right, if Mom was feeling okay, if maybe it was time to think about moving somewhere with less maintenance, somewhere with neighbors nearby. Martha had tried to explain her reasoning, but she could see that Susan was not really listening, was instead seeing only a mother who had covered her porch with livestock feed, who was living alone on a mountain, making increasingly strange decisions. Then had come the neighbors, though that word required a generous definition this far up the mountain. Bill and Carol Henderson lived 3 miles down the road, and they stopped by every few weeks to check on Martha, good people who had known her and Thomas for decades. They had arrived one October afternoon and had not even tried to hide their shock. Carol had actually laughed, then caught herself and apologized, but the damage was done. She had asked if Martha was planning to keep livestock over the winter, made a joke about turning the porch into a barn. Bill had been more direct, asking if Martha had thought this through, suggesting that the hay would just get wet and rot and make a mess, probably attract mice and other vermin. Martha had explained her plan again, but she could see they thought she was being foolish, that grief and isolation had addled her thinking. Word had spread, as it does in rural communities where everyone knows everyone, and news travels through phone lines and casual conversations at the general store. Martha began to sense a change in how people treated her. When she went to town for supplies, she noticed the looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. The clerk at the hardware store asked with exaggerated concern if she needed help with anything at the cabin, if there was anything he could do. The postmaster mentioned that his brother-in-law was a contractor who specialized in senior housing, said it with a smile, but Martha heard the implication. Even Pastor Williams, when she attended Sunday service down at the Valley Church, had sought her out to chat, asking gently about how she was coping, whether the isolation was becoming too much, whether she had considered the church's assistance program for elderly members who needed help with decision-making. Martha had endured it all with as much grace as she could muster. She was not angry, not really. She understood how it looked. She understood that people cared about her and were worried. But she also knew something they did not, something that Thomas had taught her decades ago, and that she had proven true again and again in her years on this mountain. She knew that the old ways, the practical solutions born of necessity and experience, were often mocked by those who had forgotten how to live close to the land, how to observe and adapt and make do with what was available. She knew that looking foolish and being foolish were not the same thing, and she was willing to bear the first to avoid the second. As November arrived and the weather forecast began to fill with warnings, Martha had made her preparations. She had stocked her pantry with enough food to last 3 months if necessary. She had split and stacked cord after cord of firewood, working every day until her back ached and her hands blistered, piling it under the shelter Thomas had built on the side of the cabin where it would stay dry no matter how much snow fell. She had checked her generator, her propane tanks, her water system with its line that ran deep enough underground not to freeze. She had filled her medical kit, charged her radio batteries, made sure her snowshoes and cross-country skis were in good repair. And she had inspected her hay bale barrier, making sure each bale was tight against the next, that the stacks were stable, that her simple fortress was ready for the test that was coming. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, and it came with a ferocity that surprised even those who had lived in these mountains their entire lives. The temperature had dropped to 0 overnight, and when Martha woke, she could hear the wind already building, a low moan that grew steadily into a roar. By mid-morning, snow was falling so thick she could barely see the tree line 50 yards from her cabin. By afternoon, visibility was down to a few feet, the world beyond her windows nothing but a wall of white chaos. The wind was coming from the northwest, directly at her front porch, gusting hard enough to shake the cabin walls and send plumes of snow whipping across her roof. Martha spent the day maintaining her fire, monitoring her supplies, staying warm and dry and as comfortable as possible. But her real attention was on the porch. Every hour she would bundle up and open the door just enough to look out, checking the hay bales, watching how they were handling the onslaught. What she saw gave her a fierce satisfaction, a vindication that she tried not to feel too proud about but could not entirely suppress. The hay was doing exactly what she had hoped it would do. The snow was piling up against the bales, building into drifts that grew taller as the day progressed, but the bales were holding it back. The dense hay was catching the snow, absorbing some of it, deflecting the wind, creating a dead air space between the outer wall of snow and hay and the inner space of the porch. When she shone her flashlight across the porch floor during one of her checks, she could see that while snow had blown in through the gaps she had left for access, the area immediately against the cabin walls was relatively clear, protected by the barrier. The storm lasted 3 days, a sustained assault of wind and snow that broke records across the region and left the valley towns digging out from under drifts that buried cars and collapsed weaker structures. Up on the mountain, Martha Reynolds rode it out alone, keeping warm, staying calm, rationing her energy and her resources with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. She read by lamplight. She cooked simple meals on her wood stove. She listened to weather reports on her battery radio and learned that the whole region was essentially shut down, roads impassable, power out in most places, emergency services stretched beyond capacity. She was completely cut off, but she had expected that and she was prepared for it. Her only real concern was the cabin itself, the logs and floors she had worked so hard to repair, and whether her hay bale solution would truly work or whether she would face another spring of water damage and rot. On the 4th day, the storm finally blew itself out. Martha woke to silence, that profound quiet that follows a major blizzard when the world seems to be holding its breath. She got up, stoked her fire, made coffee, and then bundled up in her heaviest coat and boots to go outside and assess the situation. When she opened her door, she was met with a wall of snow that came up to her chest, packed against the hay bales by days of relentless wind. She had to dig her way out. shoveling a path through the drift that had built up against her barrier. But eventually she emerged onto the porch and could see what the storm had done. The transformation was staggering. Snow was everywhere, piled in drifts that reached the porch roof in places, completely burying the hay bales on the windward side. The world beyond was unrecognizable, every familiar landmark softened and changed by feet of new snow. The trees were laden, branches bent almost to breaking, and the morning sun was just beginning to peek through breaking clouds, turning everything into a landscape of diamonds. It was beautiful and terrible, the kind of scene that reminded Martha why she loved this place and why it demanded respect. But what mattered most was what she found when she made her way around the porch, checking the walls, looking for the telltale signs of water penetration that had plagued her the previous winter. The hay bales had compressed under the weight of snow, but they had held their positions. The snow had piled up against them, yes, but not against the cabin itself. The crucial 6 to 8 inches of space between the hay and the cabin walls had remained largely clear, protected by the bulk of the bales. Where snow had gotten through, it was loose powder, easily swept away, not the dense packed mass that would melt and seep. Martha checked every wall, ran her hands along the logs, looked for any sign of moisture, and found none. The cabin was dry. Completely dry. Her solution had worked. She stood on her porch, hip-deep in snow, and felt emotion well up in her chest. It was vindication, yes, but more than that, it was the satisfaction of trusting her own judgment, of knowing that the skills and knowledge she had accumulated over a lifetime were still valid, still valuable. She thought of Thomas, wished he could see this, wished she could share this moment with him. But in a way she felt he already knew, that he would have expected nothing less from her, that this was simply who they were and who she still was, practical mountain people who solved problems with whatever was at hand and did not much care what others thought about their methods. It took her most of a week to dig out properly. The hay bales, when she finally uncovered them, were wet on their outer surfaces but still intact, still solid enough to have done their job. Some would need to be replaced come spring, but that was fine, a small price to pay for the protection they had provided. As she worked, slowly clearing paths and tunnels through the snow, she kept checking the cabin walls, and every check confirmed what the first had shown. There was no water, no seepage, no evidence of the problems that had caused her so much grief the previous year. The floors remained solid, the logs dry, the interior of her home untouched by the storm that had raged just feet away. It was another 2 weeks before the road was passable enough for anyone to visit. The county plow had finally made it up the mountain, clearing a single lane that would have to do until spring thaw allowed for proper maintenance. The first vehicle to arrive was Bill Henderson's old pickup, and Martha heard it coming long before she saw it, the sound of an engine laboring through snow and ice carried clearly in the cold, still air. She was outside splitting firewood when Bill and Carol pulled up, and she paused in her work to watch them approach. The looks on their faces were worth every moment of mockery she had endured in the fall. Bill walked around the cabin slowly, examining the hay bales, the snow patterns, the clear evidence of how well the barrier had functioned. Carol just stood on the porch, shaking her head slowly, a smile growing on her face. When Bill finally spoke, his voice carried a tone of genuine admiration mixed with chagrin. He said that Martha's porch had come through the storm better than his own house, that he had water damage in 3 rooms from snow that had blown in and melted, that half his neighbors down in the valley were dealing with similar problems. He asked her to explain again exactly how she had figured this out, how she had known it would work. Carol was more direct, apologizing for laughing, admitting that she had been completely wrong to doubt Martha's plan. Over the following weeks, as roads improved and word spread about how Martha's cabin had weathered the historic storm, other visitors came. Some were neighbors, curious to see the hay bale solution up close, asking questions about technique and cost. Some were people she barely knew, who had heard the story third hand and wanted to verify it for themselves. A few were contractors and builders, professional men who made their living designing and constructing mountain homes, who examined Martha's simple barrier with careful attention and grudging respect, recognizing that sometimes the most effective solutions were not the most sophisticated ones. One builder even asked if he could take photographs, said he wanted to write an article for a trade magazine about practical storm protection for mountain structures. Martha accepted all these visitors with quiet grace. She explained her reasoning, answered questions, shared the knowledge that had guided her decision. But she did not gloat, did not point out that she had been mocked, did not draw attention to the fact that those who had doubted her had been wrong. There was no need. The evidence spoke for itself, and Martha had never been one to say more than was necessary. She had learned long ago that wisdom did not need to announce itself, that the strongest proof of good thinking was simply in results. Her daughter Susan called after hearing about the storm from neighbors who had managed to reach her. The conversation was different this time, colored by new respect and maybe a touch of shame. Susan admitted that she had thought her mother was losing her grip, that the hay bales had seemed like a sign of confusion or decline. She apologized for not trusting Martha's judgment, for treating her like someone who needed to be managed rather than respected. Martha assured her that no harm was done, that she understood how it had looked, that there were no hard feelings. But she also gently suggested that perhaps Susan might trust a little more, might remember that her mother had survived and thrived on this mountain for nearly 4 decades and had learned a few things along the way. As winter deepened and the snow continued to fall, though never again with the ferocity of that first November storm, Martha maintained her cabin and her routines. She kept her fires burning, her larder stocked, her pathways clear. The hay bales remained in place, now thoroughly frozen into the snowdrifts that surrounded them, doing their job without complaint. She found a rhythm that worked, a system for checking and maintaining her barrier, for dealing with the snow that did accumulate on the porch itself. It was more work than she had dealt with in previous winters, but it was work that protected her home, that kept her dry and warm, and that felt deeply satisfying in a way that was hard to put into words. On the cold, clear nights when the temperature dropped below 0 and the stars blazed overhead with a brilliance impossible to see anywhere near civilization, Martha would sometimes stand on her porch and look out at the frozen wilderness that surrounded her. She would think about Thomas, about the life they had built here, about the children they had raised and the challenges they had faced together. She would think about the doubters and the well-meaning worriers, the people who had seen her hay bales and concluded that she was losing her way, and she would feel grateful, not for being proven right exactly, but for having the courage to trust her own judgment, to implement a solution that she believed in even when others mocked it, to remain true to the practical mountain wisdom that she and Thomas had spent a lifetime accumulating. The lesson in all of this, Martha thought, was not really about hay bales or snow or home maintenance, though those were the specifics that had brought it into focus. The lesson was about something deeper, about the value of experience, about the importance of observation and adaptation, about the danger of dismissing ideas simply because they seemed unconventional or came from unexpected sources. The world was full of people who knew theories but had never faced the practical realities those theories were meant to address. The mountains had taught Martha to test her ideas against reality, to value what worked over what looked impressive, to trust the knowledge that came from actually living with the consequences of her decisions. She thought too about the way people often discounted the elderly, particularly elderly women living alone, assuming that age brought decline rather than wisdom, that unconventional solutions were signs of confusion rather than creativity. She had experienced that bias directly in the months before the storm, had felt the sting of being treated like someone who needed help making simple decisions, whose judgment could no longer be trusted. The fact that her solution had worked so dramatically was gratifying, but more than that, it was a reminder to herself and hopefully to others that experience and practical knowledge did not expire with age, that sometimes the person who seemed to be doing something foolish was actually the only one who truly understood the problem. As February arrived and the days began to slowly lengthen, Martha started planning for spring. She would need to remove the hay bales once the snow melted, stack them somewhere dry, perhaps cover them with tarps. Some could be reused next winter, though she would need to buy fresh ones to replace those that had gotten too wet or compressed. She was already thinking ahead to next fall, considering refinements to her system, ways to make it even more effective. Maybe she would add a second barrier, create an airspace between two walls of hay for even better protection. Maybe she would experiment with positioning, see if angling the bales differently might deflect wind more efficiently. The engineer in her, the problem solver that Thomas had always loved, was already at work on the next iteration. But for now, in the heart of winter, she was content. Her home was dry and warm, her systems were working, her stores were adequate. She had proven to herself and to others that she still had what it took to survive and thrive on this mountain. More than that, she had honored the legacy that she and Thomas had built together, the legacy of practical wisdom and self-reliance that had defined their life here. Every log in this cabin, every floorboard, every window had a story, and now the hay bales had their own story, too. A story about trusting yourself when others doubt you, about looking beyond appearances to underlying function, about the enduring value of simple solutions to complex problems. On the 1st of March, a warm Chinook wind swept up from the south, bringing temperatures that rose into the 40s for the first time since October. Snow began to melt in earnest, dripping from the eaves, sliding off the roof in small avalanches, revealing patches of brown earth that Martha had not seen in months. She went out to check her hay bales and found them beginning to sag as the snow around them melted, water running freely now, where for months everything had been locked in ice. She ran her hand along the cabin logs, checking one final time, and found them completely dry, completely sound, untouched by the moisture that was now everywhere else. Her solution had worked not just during the storm, but through the entire winter, through every temperature fluctuation, every minor thaw and refreeze. It was a complete success. Word of Martha's hay bale solution spread beyond her immediate community that spring. Someone shared photos online, and they made their way through social media channels devoted to homesteading and mountain living. A blogger who focused on sustainable living wrote a piece about her technique. A small newspaper down in Missoula ran a human interest story about the widow who had outsmarted the worst winter storm in a generation with nothing but hay and common sense. Martha found herself something of a minor celebrity in certain circles, though she neither sought nor particularly enjoyed the attention. What mattered to her was not the recognition, but the knowledge that perhaps she had helped others, that maybe someone else facing a similar problem would think about her solution and adapt it to their own circumstances. She received letters and emails from people around the country, other mountain dwellers who struggled with snow infiltration, farmers dealing with barn problems, even suburban homeowners trying to protect their homes from harsh winter weather. She answered what she could, sharing the details of her method, encouraging people to adapt rather than copy, to observe their own specific conditions and design solutions that fit their unique situations. This, she explained in her responses, was the real lesson. Not that hay bales were a magic solution for every problem, but that observation, creativity, and willingness to try unconventional approaches could lead to effective solutions that experts might never consider. As spring progressed into summer and Martha worked on her garden and her maintenance projects, she often reflected on the previous fall and winter. She thought about how close she had come to giving in to doubt, to the voices of well-meaning people who had suggested that her plan was foolish, that she should hire professionals, that perhaps she was no longer capable of solving these problems on her own. She thought about what might have happened if she had listened, if she had abandoned her plan and tried something more conventional and expensive that might not have worked any better. The cost would have been financial, certainly, but more than that, it would have been emotional, a surrender of agency, an admission that she no longer trusted her own judgment. Instead, she had held firm. She had trusted decades of experience, had believed in her own observations and reasoning, and had been proven right in the most dramatic way possible. It was a victory not just over snow and winter, but over self-doubt, over the pressure to conform, over the subtle and not-so-subtle messages that she was past the age where her decisions should be respected. Every time she looked at where the hay bales had stood, now removed and stacked away for next winter, she felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with self-respect. The following fall, as November approached once again and the forecast called for another hard winter, Martha prepared her hay bale barrier early. This time, no one laughed. Bill Henderson stopped by to help her stack the bales, bringing his son-in-law who was new to mountain living and wanted to learn the technique. Carol brought coffee and cookies and stayed to chat, talking about how they were implementing similar solutions at their own place. Several neighbors asked if they could buy bales from the same delivery when Martha ordered hers, wanting to try the system for themselves. Young Danny Larson, now working as a full-time ranch hand, told Martha that his boss had mentioned her name when discussing winter preparations for their livestock shelters, praising her ingenuity. The transformation in how people treated her was subtle but significant. She was no longer the eccentric widow who needed watching over, the lonely old woman whose strange decisions were symptoms of isolation and decline. She was Martha Reynolds, the woman who had figured out an elegant solution to a difficult problem, whose practical wisdom and willingness to think differently had proven valuable not just for herself, but for her entire community. When she spoke now, people listened. When she suggested ideas, they were considered seriously. She had earned a new kind of respect, or perhaps had simply reclaimed the respect that should have been hers all along. But Martha knew that respect from others, while nice, was not the most important thing she had gained from the experience. What mattered most was the respect she had maintained for herself, the trust in her own judgment that she had refused to surrender even when it seemed everyone else thought she was wrong. That internal certainty, that core of self-reliance and confidence, was what had sustained her through Thomas's death, through the doubts and worries that came with living alone on a mountain, through every challenge and setback. The hay bales had been just one test, one moment when that certainty was challenged, but by holding firm she had reinforced it, had proven to herself that she could still trust her own mind and her own abilities. As winter settled in once again, as the first snows began to fall and the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, Martha sat by her fire with a book and a cup of tea, warm and dry and at peace. Outside, her hay bale barrier stood ready, modified slightly from the previous year based on what she had learned, but fundamentally the same simple solution that had worked so well before. She had no doubt that it would work again, that when spring came her cabin would be dry and sound, that she would have made it through another winter, not despite her age but because of the wisdom that came with it. The story of Martha Reynolds and her hay bales became a kind of local legend, the sort of tale that gets told in hardware stores and around dinner tables, used as an example of mountain wisdom and the value of thinking differently. But for Martha herself, it was just one chapter in a longer story. A life lived close to the land, facing challenges with creativity and courage, trusting in what she knew and was not afraid to act on that knowledge even when others doubted. The mountains had taught her that survival required both strength and flexibility, both adherence to proven principles and willingness to adapt and innovate. She had learned that wisdom came not from following rules blindly, but from understanding the reasons behind them and knowing when to follow different rules of your own making. If there is something to be learned from Martha's story, something that extends beyond the specific question of hay bales and snow, it is this. Do not be too quick to judge unconventional solutions or dismiss ideas from unexpected sources. The person who seems to be doing something foolish may be the only one who truly understands the problem. Experience and observation, particularly experience hard-won through years of direct engagement with challenges, is worth more than theoretical knowledge or conventional wisdom that has never been tested against reality. And perhaps most importantly, trust yourself. When you have done your homework, considered your options, and arrived at a solution that makes sense to you, have the courage to implement it even if others mock you, even if it looks strange, even if you cannot find anyone else who has tried it before. The best solutions often come from individuals who are willing to think differently, to trust their own judgment, to act on what they know rather than what they are told. As the winter wind howls outside and the snow piles up against simple barriers of compressed hay, as an elderly widow sits warm and dry in a cabin she built with her own hands and protected with her own ingenuity, there is a message for all of us about resilience, about wisdom, about the courage to trust ourselves even when the whole world seems to doubt us. Martha Reynolds proved that age brings not decline, but accumulation, not weakness, but strength, refined by experience, not confusion, but clarity, born of long observation. Her story reminds us that the most powerful solutions are often the simplest ones, that creativity and common sense can triumph over skepticism and convention, and that one person with courage and determination can face down the worst that nature and doubt can throw at them and emerge victorious. If you found inspiration in Martha's story, if you appreciate tales of practical wisdom, mountain living, and the courage to trust your own judgment in the face of doubt, then consider subscribing to this channel. We share more stories like this one, stories of real people facing real challenges with ingenuity and determination, stories of survival and self-reliance that remind us what humans are capable of when we trust ourselves and refuse to give up. Hit that subscribe button and join a community of people who value wisdom over convention, courage over conformity, and the enduring human capacity to find solutions where others see only problems. Thank you for listening to Martha's story, and remember that sometimes the person everyone thinks is foolish is actually the wisest one in the room.